Just remember them crying. There was a lot of crying in this place, a lot of tears. And yet we find out it was like thousands upon thousands of children that were being abused.
The kids were being raped and molested in large numbers.
What took place in residential schools amounts to nothing short of cultural genocide.
A devastating discovery has been made in Canada.
Of 215 children at a former residential school in BC.
Some as young as 3 years old.
My dad, Henry, my brother Bobby, my Uncle John, my Uncle Louis, my cousins and aunts, and myself right here.
My name is Rose Grace Miller. I am survivor of the Kamloops Indian Residential School in Kamloops.
The Kamloops Residential School was run by the Catholic Church. It operated from 1890 until 1977. Among the First Nations children from across BC's interior who were forcibly brought here.
I was only 8 years old at the time. We were loaded onto a cattle truck in 1949 and brought to the residential school, my 2 brothers and myself.
Physical and sexual abuse by headmasters and teachers was common. The Kamloops school closed in 1978, but rumours persisted that the deaths of many children had been covered up.
We knew that there was missing children. We knew there was children that were buried on the hillside there and probably on the school. We knew there was people burned in an incinerator just below our rec room. Could have been my brothers, it could have been me. Couldn't have ran away. I could have drowned in a river. I was only 8 years old.
My reaction to the news out of Kamloops from last week was, of course, great sadness and sympathy for the families of those children who never did come back from residential school. But I wasn't surprised by it. I don't for a minute believe that this is the only one in Canada.
Well, we have breaking news tonight of another terrible finding.
A Saskatchewan First Nation says it has found hundreds of unmarked graves at the site of another former residential school.
We started our radar penetrating research on June the 2nd of 2021. As of yesterday, we have hit 751 unmarked graves. This is not a mass grave site. These are unmarked graves.
What was going on across this country that so many children were being taken? So many children were being put into residential schools.
When Europeans arrived in North America and began settling the land, they didn't stop at just taking land from Indigenous peoples. They brought with them a policy to snuff out the so-called Indian problem. The first Indian residential schools started opening in the 1870s, the beginning of what some have called the darkest chapter in Canadian history.
In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
By 1920, the Indian Act was amended to make it mandatory for status Indian children to attend residential school. When their parents refused to send them away, police showed up and forcibly took them.
Just remember them crying. There was a lot of crying in this place, a lot of tears. And yet we find out it was like thousands upon thousands of children that were being abused.
You never knew it when you went over the line. They let you know by giving you a beating. Beating sounds so simple, but it was more than that. It was terror, eh? that accompanied each beating.
When you have children put in an electric chair for entertainment or for punishment, those are crimes against humanity.
But here's where I got molested, right here. I remember standing against this wall there, and he had his way with me. And I was just about that high. It's the time in my life when I felt so dirty and so all alone. Our lives are shrouded in secrecy. No one could know what we all collectively knew, that kids were being raped and molested in large numbers, sodomized by beasts. No one could know. No one would ever know.
The mortality rate of those children who attended those schools was significantly higher than the mortality rate of the average Canadian child.
Not sure we'll ever get a final answer, but I'm absolutely convinced the number is much higher, perhaps as much as 5 to 10 times as high as that. It's because the records are so poor.
Many records were pulped by the federal government. Funeral records destroyed, Indian agent reports destroyed, student lists destroyed.
When I realized the effect that this type of government administration had on thousands of people in my time, it disgusts me that I'm a Canadian, and I always thought Canada was the greatest country in the world. And I'm ashamed to say I'm Canadian because of what my government has done.
Madam President, I thank Madam.
We call for a thorough and impartial investigation into all cases where crimes were committed against the Indigenous people, especially the children.
In 2007, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history recognized the damage inflicted by residential schools. Canada formally apologized the following year.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history.
We will renew and respect that relationship.
The federal government was invited by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 to investigate sites at residential schools, and they refused to do so at that point. This is just a long time in coming in which communities have been seeking to find out where their children are.
They talk about reconciliation, but the first part of reconciliation is always truth. But truth is not something that our policymakers in this country ever want to engage.
So what's changed since then? Some ask if this country has even grasped the truth of our shared history. What actions have been taken? How far have we come? Indigenous people currently account for roughly 5% of the population, and yet nearly half of all the children in care in this country are Indigenous. More than a quarter of the adults locked up in prisons are Indigenous. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls may be well underway, but the deaths and disappearances continue today. It's time to take a hard look at this country's progress on reconciliation.